With the war over and the North victorious, the Union victorious, we now move on to the Reconstruction of America. But here's the thing, as we're talking about the Reconstruction of America, you essentially have varied perspectives about how to carry out this Reconstruction. On one hand, you have Abraham Lincoln, who, with the adoption of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, is of the fervent mindset by this period in the end of the war that slavery was an abomination and African Americans must be set free. But at the same time, we are going to see him sort of hedging his bets in terms of what he is demanding with this Reconstruction. Because at the end of the day, Abraham Lincoln, though he is calling for the end of slavery, he is also calling for the reuniting of the Union, North and South. So therefore, he does not speak as forcefully for change as some other Americans will. And these other Americans that I'm referring to, and we'll talk about a lot more in depth in this lecture, are what is known as the Radical Republicans. So this group, and remember, Abraham Lincoln himself was a Republican, but these Radical Republicans were seeking a total revamp of the entire United States, which meant not only freeing the slaves, but also bringing about social, economic, and other forms of equality across the board throughout this new United States that is now reconstructed during this period. Now, the third voice that comes into play is another Republican once again, a guy by the name of Andrew Johnson, who will replace Abraham Lincoln after his assassination. Johnson was a unique character because he was a Unionist. He was Abraham Lincoln's vice president, but nonetheless he was from the South. And because of this, we see him as being the main impediment, and he will become the main enemy and roadblock to the vision for America that the Radical Republicans had. But nonetheless, in talking about all of these different perspectives, we're going to continue to pick up on a similar theme, and that is the theme of the role of the federal government. Because tied into this debate that is going on during Reconstruction, we go back to that old boogeyman, if you will, from a lot of perspectives during this time, that the federal government should not be too strong. And that is really what is driving this debate here during the Reconstruction era. The Radical Republicans want the federal government to take the lead on this Reconstruction and essentially punish the southern states and make certain demands on the southern states that they must abide by. Well, critics, including Andrew Johnson, will say, no, we should return to states' rights. So just keep that in mind too as we're talking about none of these things. But without further ado, let's turn to the actual content of this lecture. The title of this slide, Internal Reconstruction, refers to the fact that even before we see some of these national debates going on, particularly between Abraham Lincoln and the Radical Republicans, we see evidence of what one historian has labeled internal reconstruction. And by this, I mean that already in the fall of 1863, debates over how to reunify the nation following the Civil War and what sort of political, social, and economic restructuring was needed in the South dominated discussions in the North. Now, Lincoln did not yet have a comprehensive plan for Reconstruction, but many of the border states were actually already carrying out, again, what one historian, Eric Foner, has labeled internal reconstruction. Therefore, by the end of 1864, border states like Maryland and Missouri had already amended their constitutions to prohibit slavery. Not long after this, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Louisiana, which were all under the control of Union forces by this point in 1864, also ended slavery. So what we see here, in short, is even before, again, a national program is developed, a national blueprint is developed to decide what Reconstruction will actually involve, we see the border states and we see those Confederate states under Union control actually already taking the first step of Reconstruction, and that is this 13th Amendment, that will become the 13th Amendment, which is the end of slavery. So as this is going on, what we begin to see as well, though, is more and more talk at the national level about what to do. And at the national level, there essentially existed two approaches. First of all, in discussing these plans for national Reconstruction, we need to refer to the Radical Republicans, the Radical Republicans' vision. Now, one of the leading Radical Republicans during this era was the individual that we see on the right hand of the screen, top right hand, I should say, Radical Republican Charles Sumner. Charles Sumner offered a treatise in September of 1863 titled, quote, Our Domestic Relations, or How to Treat the Rebel States, which argued for Congress, rather than the President, to control wartime Reconstruction. Why? Why did this document here in September of 1863 call for Congress to control national Reconstruction? Well, basically, Sumner was worried that giving the president too much power would sort of diminish what could be done. And in particular, Sumner believed that Confederate states had committed, in his words, quote, state suicide, and thus they reverted back to being territories. And therefore, according to the Constitution, Congress had the right to determine territorial affairs. What did Sumner want to do with these so-called territories, if you will, because again, these states had, in his mind, committed, quote, suicide. Sumner wanted to redistribute land from the plantation owners to who he described as, quote, patriotic soldiers, poor whites, and freedmen. Patriotic soldiers, poor whites, and freedmen. That's who, again, would get the land under Sumner's land redistribution program here. Well, in opposition to this approach, we would see the individual on the bottom right-hand corner. He was a Postmaster General, a guy by the name of Montgomery Blair. Now, Montgomery Blair offered this long titled theory, blueprint, and that was called, quote, On the Revolutionary Schemes of the Ultra-Abolitionists and in Defense of the Policy of the President. In short, what we see here, the revolutionary schemes of the ultra-abolitionists, that is in reference to the Radical Republicans and the plan that we just talked about with Charles Sumner. What we see here, Montgomery Blair offering, is defense of the president's perspective. Blair offered what he believed was Lincoln's idea of empowering the loyalist Southern masses the authority to determine their own affairs. And this would, in short, weaken the rebel leaders who were in control of these lands previously and who carried out the secession. So what we see here is very much clearly of the mindset of Lincoln as well during this time. The idea that the South should be allowed to reconstruct themselves as long as you give the power to, again, those Union loyalists and the masses of people, and take the power away from the rebels and the Confederate leaders. After these more theoretical arguments that we just saw play out, whether it be Sumner's plan or Montgomery Blair's plan, we also have, in addition to that, sort of more concrete proposals about how to deal with the southern states as the nation moves towards restoration of the Union. So what we are essentially going to see here once again is Lincoln versus Congress. And what this slide is going to go into is not only each individual plan, but at the end of the day, which side won out, at least temporarily. To begin this story, we're going to turn to late 1863, because it was then that President Lincoln issued his Proclamation of Amnesty and Reconstruction, which came to be known simply as the 10% Plan, for obvious reasons, as we'll see. What this 10% plan did was, it granted amnesty to, or more simply pardoned, all rebels who took an oath of loyalty to the Union and the Constitution. And here's where the name comes in. Once 10% of a state's voters had taken a loyalty oath and recognized the, quote, permanent freedom of slaves, according to this proposed bill, a seceded state could re-enter the Union. Now here's the thing, under Lincoln's 10% plan, only Confederate government officials and military officers would be denied amnesty. In short, the top leaders of the rebelling state would be denied amnesty. Radical Republicans rejected this plan for a couple of big reasons. First of all, they believed that it was far too lenient on the South because, again, it only targeted the military elites and those in government positions. It allowed the everyday normal rebels of the South to remain in power, essentially. They also argued, did the radical Republicans' critics of this 10% plan, that any Reconstruction required not only ending slavery, again, the quote, permanent freedom of slaves, but also giving these freedmen, who are no longer slaves, the right to vote. So with these criticisms in mind, the following year, in 1864, we would see the radical Republicans offer their alternative approach to Reconstruction. This proposal, known as the Wade-Davis Bill, came from Senator Benjamin Wade, who is pictured on the far right of the screen, and Representative Harry Winter Davis. He is on the left hand of this screen. They again would propose the Wade-Davis Bill in February 1864 as an alternative to Lincoln's 10% plan. As opposed to the 10% in Lincoln's plan, this new proposal required 50% of a seceded state's voters to declare allegiance to the Union and swear that they never fought in the Confederacy. Moreover, linked to their earlier complaints that we talked about that they had about the 10% plan, moreover, the Wade-Davis Bill demanded not just freedom for slaves, but also granting them voting rights as well. Confederate officials and veterans would not be allowed to vote. Additionally, and this is important here, we would also see military governors would be appointed by the president with the consent of the Senate to control these formerly seceded states. In short, this bill ensured that Congress, rather than the states, would maintain control over Reconstruction. This is that idea again of who should determine the fate of Reconstruction. Is it the federal government through Congress, or is it the states? And we see that playing out here early on in this discussion. This bill, the Wade-Davis Bill, would be passed in July of 1864, but Lincoln did not like it. So therefore what he did was he pocket vetoed the bill. He pocket vetoed the bill, meaning that he did not sign the bill within 10 days of the adjournment of Congress, so therefore it was automatically denied. It was automatically rejected. So at the end of the day, despite neither of these plans being put into action, Lincoln was a victor solely because he denied the radical Republicans their Wade-Davis bill. Well, what we are eventually going to see is, of course, shortly after all of this, in 1865, of course, Abraham Lincoln will be assassinated, and he will be replaced by his vice president, Andrew Johnson, who will become even more of an archenemy to the radical Republicans, as we'll see. Following Abraham Lincoln's assassination in April of 1865, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, a pro-Union Democratic politician, so here he was, before he became the vice president, actually an opposition party candidate who was also a major politician from Tennessee, would now join the Abraham Lincoln administration in the ticket in 1864. And he would become president. So this former Democrat, this Southerner from Tennessee, would now become president here in April of 1865. Many radical Republicans, despite him being a Southern Democrat, actually believed that Johnson would seek a greater degree of punishment and retribution against the former Confederacy than Lincoln had in his last year of life, as we saw the debate going on in the previous slides. And the reason why is because Andrew Johnson really detested the Southern elites. What we see, these planter elites, another way to put it. And the reason why is because Johnson's state elite plantation owners, those individuals from Tennessee, never supported his political ambitions. So the belief was that Johnson would particularly target them in his Reconstruction policies and in the process side with the radical Republicans. So therefore, when Johnson actually became president here in the spring of 1865, he sought retribution against the elite plantation owners who never again supported his bid for political office in Tennessee, where he would actually serve as mayor, state legislature, governor, congressman, and senator before becoming Abraham Lincoln's vice president. But here's the important thing. Despite detesting these planter elites, what we begin to see is that at the end of the day, Andrew Johnson still wanted to protect states' rights. He was still a Southerner, and he still wanted to protect these states' rights and use Reconstruction mainly as a tool to take power away from the wealthy planters and give it to the white middle class of the South. Because leave no doubt about this, Andrew Johnson was not seeking equality for the races. Johnson was, very simply, a racist. And in fact, in 1866, and there are tons of other examples we could point to, but one of the most notable here comes from 1866. Andrew Johnson had remarked the following, quote, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." Clearly, his vision, far removed from that of the radical Republicans, who were seeking, again, an equal playing field for all of mankind, white or black. It did not matter to the Republicans, the radical Republicans. That is not the same as what was going on in the mind of Andrew Johnson, as we saw with that quote. So therefore, we can see early on reasons for disagreement between the two sides. Well, on May 29th, 1865, about a month after he took office here in the White House, Andrew Johnson issued his amnesty proclamation. His amnesty proclamation stipulated that Confederates who took an oath of allegiance to the U.S. government would have their political and property rights restored. That being said, his amnesty proclamation denied a pardon to high-ranking Confederate officials and the antebellum, meaning pre-Civil War, elite planters who had property worth more than $20,000. Well, here's the thing. This at least was, again, targeting those elite Southerners, whether it be Confederate officials or the wealthy. But as we see, before he actually left office, Andrew Johnson would grant full pardon and amnesty to more than 15,000 Southerners. So clearly, he was a friend of the South. And what we are going to see as well is Johnson's plan for readmitting states into the Union involved him personally appointing provisional, meaning temporary governors for each state. Now, many of these provisional governors that he selected were actually former Confederates themselves. These governors had various powers, including the authority to fill appointive offices. Not surprisingly, as these provisional governors appointed by Andrew Johnson took on this task of filling these appointive offices, these governors would appoint thousands upon thousands of ex-rebels to political office, which ensured that the freed blacks who were now living in these southern states as supposed equals to whites would be denied basic freedoms. Even Alexander Stephens, the former Confederate vice president, won a seat in Congress for the state of Georgia. So eventually, according to this amnesty proclamation, after ratifying new constitutions and electing new state governments, Johnson promised that these states would then be readmitted into the Union. Nonetheless, readmission did require Southern states to ratify the 13th Amendment, and the 13th Amendment is one of the Reconstruction amendments that ended slavery. But what we are seeing here is clearly someone who is even worse in many ways than was Abraham Lincoln when it came to sort of a soft-handed approach to dealing with those southern states that had seceded and started the Civil War. Radical Republicans stood in the way of Johnson's plans for Reconstruction. And once again, one of the leaders of this radical Reconstruction movement to prevent Johnson's plan from being enacted was the individual to the right, the far right, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, and along with him another character that we have not discussed previously, a guy by the name of Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. So they would lead this group of radical Republicans. Now these radical Republicans, as I referenced in the past and now I want to build on, fully embraced expanding powers of the federal government. To what end though? What was the purpose of empowering the federal government? To do what? Well, Charles Sumner, in June of 1865, declared the following, quote, "Liberty has been won. the battle for equality is still pending. In short, with that quote, Charles Sumner meant freedom was not enough for radical Republicans. It was not enough to simply break the chains off of the slaves and give them freedom. Radical Republicans like Charles Sumner also called for social and political equality for the freed slaves. Additionally, as we've already referenced earlier as well, radical Republicans wanted Congress to control Reconstruction. As Thaddeus Stevens remarked in December 1865, quote, "The future condition of the conquered power depends on the will of the conqueror. They must come in as new states or remain as conquered provinces. Congress is the only power that can act in the matter." Listen to some of the words that he used. The conquered power depends on the will of the conqueror. Thaddeus Stevens is of the mindset that the North should be the conqueror. The North won the Civil War, therefore they should get the spoils of the war. And in this case, for the radical Republicans, the spoils of the war were creating a new society where slaves were not just no longer a reality, that was a thing of the past, but actually African Americans were equal to whites in society, in economics, and in other ways. So to this end, to carry out their goals, what we are going to see is in December of 1965, the new Congress, whose members were elected back in 1864, met for the first time to create a smooth path for their Reconstruction program. They actually used a little kind of constitutional gaming, if you will, to achieve their ends. So what they essentially did was, this new Congress here meeting for the first time in late 1865, immediately confronted Johnson's, quote, rebel officials, those who again were elected essentially under these state governments that had been created by Johnson through his amnesty proclamation. And the radical Republicans did this. Because they held a 3-to-1 advantage over these Democrats, who again were elected in the South by the new states that were created by Andrew Johnson's amnesty proclamation. So with this 3-to-1 advantage over the Democrats, we would see moderate Republicans join radical Republicans in throwing out all Southern representatives from the Congress. They removed them entirely from Congress. How did they do this? How did radical Republicans actually carry this out? How did they defend it? Well, these radical Republicans claimed that they could remove those Southern Democrats from Congress due to the powers accorded to Congress in Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 5 of the Constitution allowed each House of Congress, meaning the House of Representatives and the Senate, to judge the qualifications of its members. Because these members were ex-rebels and ex-Confederates, the radical Republicans deemed them unqualified and unfit for office. Therefore, they removed them. And without that opposition in Congress, the radical Republicans carried out a massively expansive and progressive vision for America, a reconstructed America. So what did this vision actually look like? Well, one of the first things that this Congress did was they sought to help the freed slaves obtain economic independence with the creation in March 1865 of the Bureau of Refugees. This Bureau of Refugees was known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The long name, as you can see on the screen, the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. The short name, the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau had a variety of agents across the United States, particularly the South. And what these agents did was they required employers and laborers to sign written contracts that specified work to be done and wages to be paid. So this is obviously a far cry from the usual economic relations between African Americans and whites down in the South. But these officials, more important than actually creating these written contracts between black workers and white landowners, these bureau officials, these Freedmen's Bureau officials, also mediated disputes between the Southern whites and the freedmen. And in doing so, according to research done later by historians, these Freedmen's Bureau officials usually decided in favor of the latter, meaning the freedmen, more than 2/3 of the time, more than 68% of the time. Finally, in addition to creating these written contracts, dealing with disputes between workers and employers, we also see Freedmen's Bureau officers renting abandoned lands. And these abandoned lands are basically those lands that were left by the plantation owners during the war because they were scared of losing their life, so the plantation owners fled. So now the federal government, through the Freedmen's Bureau, is actually taking these abandoned lands and they are giving them to refugees who were loyal to the Union. Who do you think these refugees loyal to the Union were? These loyal Southerners were mostly African American, of course. So not only is the Freedmen's Bureau, again, helping African Americans obtain fair employment conditions, but they're also now giving them lands. Now, they're not giving them land free. These are rented lands, essentially. But what's important here is after 3 years of renting those lands, African Americans could purchase it. They had the option to buy it, actually. Well, in addition to all of this that we talked about, the Freedmen's Bureau also provided medical care, clothing, and food. All of this was distributed by the Bureau. And in the first 3 years, what we are going to see, in the first 3 years, the Bureau had also distributed more than 20 million meals. So in short, the many areas of life that the Freedmen's Bureau touched is amazing. But the thing is, despite these gains and despite these actions, it struggled to carry out its programs. And that was mainly due to being just 1,000 agents. There were just 1,000 agents across the entire South. Moreover, the Freedmen's Bureau faced a lot of opposition down in the South. Not surprisingly, as a lot of white Southerners were up in arms over what the Freedmen's Bureau was doing. They were upsetting society in the South. So therefore, we are going to see these white Southerners attacking national government action on behalf of the freed slaves as an attempt by the Republican Party to destroy small, limited government. That is the argument that these white Southerners claimed. That the Republican Party, by helping the African Americans, were trying to destroy small, limited government. So eventually what we are going to see is the Bureau will slowly die out, and it will close completely in 1872, after Congress allowed its authorization to expire. And leave no doubt about it, a lot of this came because of that Southern reaction. Here we can see all the way back in 1866, January of 1866, DeBow's Review, a Southern newspaper, said the following, quote, "Now that the Negro is free, he has received enough at the hands of the nation without expense to himself." In short, this is saying no more government handouts to these freed slaves. They got their freedom, now let them work on their own dime and at their own effort to achieve some sort of success. The government should not be giving these handouts to these African Americans. That is essentially what the South was fighting for, and they would eventually get again as the Freedmen's Bureau died out by 1872. In addition to the Freedmen's Bureau, we also see a proposal, an eventual piece of legislation that is passed that does exactly what Charles Sumner had called for far earlier in this lecture, and that was to control the southern states, the federal government to control the federal states. And essentially what happens is the South is turned into an occupied country, a war zone. In 1866, we have the congressional elections. And in these congressional elections in 1866, radical Republicans won more than 2/3 a majority in both the House and the Senate, which meant that they could now override Andrew Johnson's veto. Because Andrew Johnson, as president, obviously had that authority, and he disliked what the radical Republicans were doing, so he often vetoed bills. But now with this strong showing in the 1866 congressional elections, radical Republicans could do as they pleased. They did just that with the passage in 1867 of something known as the Reconstruction Act. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 abolished the new governments, quote, in the rebel states that were established under Johnson's lenient Reconstruction policies. The Reconstruction Act also divided the South into 5 military districts, each under the command of a U.S. general. Tennessee, as it turned out, as you can see on this map to the right that shows where these military districts were, Tennessee was not included in this bill because it had actually already ratified the 14th Amendment. And as a note here, just in passing, we're going to talk a lot more about these amendments. I mentioned the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. The 14th Amendment was an amendment that guaranteed equality if you were a citizen of the United States. We're going to talk a lot more about these in the next lecture, so just keep that in mind. But nonetheless, Tennessee had already ratified that amendment, so they were not included in this, again, Reconstruction Act of 1867. So what would happen in these military districts that were established here in March of 1867? Well, essentially, the U.S. government, through the U.S. military, would step in and register all black male voters for new constitutional conventions. To re-enter the Union, former Confederate states within these military districts had to create new state constitutions that would now be partially created through black voters that guaranteed the following: all adult males, black and white, the right to vote. Furthermore, once the new state constitutions were created that ensured the right to vote for whites and blacks, a state would be readmitted into the Union once it ratified the 14th Amendment. What we are going to see is this is a dramatic success. By the fall of 1867, every southern state except Mississippi, which had 83%, had over 90% of its African American male population registered to vote. This was huge because what is going to happen is a lot of these southern states are now going to elect congressmen that are black, something unheard of. But as we'll see in the next election, as it turns out, this will be short-lived. But don't let that diminish the success of this Reconstruction Act, this Military Reconstruction Act. But nonetheless, we would see beyond this, military officers use their powers to achieve other goals as well. For instance, in South Carolina, Daniel Sickles, who was one of the military officials in that state, ordered his men to not only register voters, but also the following: remove elected officials, prohibit assemblies of Confederate veterans, and even block the sale of alcohol. But again, just like we saw with the Freedmen's Bureau, the Military Reconstruction Act did not go as far as it could because of a lack of manpower. Only 10,000 federal troops were spread across these 10 states to enforce this new Reconstruction. Only 10,000 federal troops across these 10 states. This paled in comparison to the size of the federal army that was out west. The majority of the troops during this time were actually in the west to fight the Indian Wars, to basically kill the Indians and move them off the lands in the west. But beyond that, we also see the military itself shrinking in size, because what is going to happen between 1865 and 1871 is the federal army shrank from about 1 million men right after the Civil War to just 30,000 by 1871. Nonetheless, despite these problems of enforcement, President Johnson would describe the act as, quote, absolute despotism, and he claimed that military officers in the South would be used for the, quote, Africanizing of the South. As you can see, two big things there. First of all, with that first phrase, absolute despotism, Andrew Johnson is saying the federal government is too strong. It's too powerful. That's not a good thing. And the second thing, Africanizing of the South, clearly he's playing the race card. He is saying you cannot have a society where whites and blacks are equal. That was his thing. But nonetheless, we see here the radical Republicans with tons of power in Congress pushing through their vision for a reconstructed America, one in which blacks and whites are equal. So final blow is the title of this slide with a question mark, because it seems that Andrew Johnson perhaps is teetering and maybe the radical Republicans are finally going to get him out of the way and to carry out even more dramatic reforms. So let's talk a little bit about this final act, if you will, in this fight between radical Republicans and Johnson. In 1867, radical Republicans passed the Tenure of Office Act, which stipulated that the Senate must approve any presidential effort to remove federal officials already confirmed by the Senate. In other words, if the Senate confirmed someone to a government post, the President of the United States could not remove that individual unless he went back to the Senate to get their approval of this removal. Nonetheless, despite this law being passed in 1867, to slow Reconstruction to a halt, President Johnson replaced one of his harshest critics, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who was carrying out many of the things of the Reconstruction Act that we talked about of 1867. Republicans in Congress were up in arms, and they claimed that Johnson had violated the law that was passed in 1867 by firing Stanton, and therefore they decided that they were going to impeach the president. As everyone fully understood, though, despite Andrew Johnson going against this 1867 law, the impeachment stemmed less from, quote, high crimes and misdemeanors, which is required according to the Constitution to impeach a president or any other official. It was less about that, high crimes and misdemeanors, than radical Republicans simply wanting to remove a barrier to their vision for Reconstruction. In fact, Secretary of the Navy, a guy by the name of Gideon Welles, remarked in his diary in February 1867 the following: "There is no high crime or misdemeanor in these articles that calls for impeachment, and those who may vote to convict upon these articles would as readily vote to impeach the president had he been accused of stepping on a dog's tail." In short, this individual, Gideon Welles, who is questioning the radical Republicans' reasons for impeachment, is basically saying they would have been willing to impeach Johnson. They would have been lining up to impeach him had he simply stepped on a dog's tail. But nonetheless, despite these efforts, the Senate failed by just one vote, to convict the president, and therefore he was acquitted, and therefore he would remain president. Now here's the important thing. Not only did radical Republicans fail to remove Johnson from office, but their actions, which seemed to many people to be overreach, also weakened support for congressional Reconstruction. For instance, the Richmond Daily Telegraph. Now, again, the Richmond Daily Telegraph from Richmond, Virginia, the former capital of the Confederacy. This is obviously a little biased to begin with, but nonetheless it shows you the growing disdain for congressional Reconstruction. It opined here in 1868 the following: "A terrible rebuke on the Radical Party and diminished its physical force it never had any other." So clearly what we see here is after 1868, as we'll see in the next lecture in even more detail, we see the radical Republicans struggling to continue their steamroller of reform that they had enacted during this period. But nonetheless, there will be some other positives before Reconstruction is eventually overturned during this period, a topic that we'll leave for the next and final lecture of the semester.